Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face.
Between 1870 and 1996, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent to residential schools. Their identities were stolen, cultures extinguished. They were undernourished, neglected, and often abused. There were more than 4,100 confirmed deaths. Did your school have a graveyard?
Our guest this week is Kwakwaka'wakw artist, master carver, filmmaker, author, and professor Carey Newman. Perhaps his most recognized work is the Witness Blanket, which is made of hundreds of items collected from residential schools, government buildings, and churches across Canada. Carey, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to the show, and we're here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where you'll be launching your book and a national book tour for Picking Up the Pieces, Residential School Memories, and the Making of the Witness Blanket. What can you tell us about the book?
Well, it's sort of maybe the last piece in a series of projects associated with the Witness Blanket, and it came about through an editor at Orca Book in Victoria who came to one of the events where we had the Witness Blanket set up. And she asked, have you ever thought of writing a book about your experience about this project? And at the time I hadn't really thought about it. I'd always kind of envisioned that if I were going to write about this, it would be way later in my life as I reflected back. But they sort of convinced me that it's an important story to tell, and that we could tell it in a way where I could still do that, the memoir thing later if I chose.
There's also a documentary that you co-directed. Why was it important to have these documents explaining the experience that it?
What I see now is the blanket can only be in one place. Right, but the book or the documentary can be in many places, and they can tell the story in different ways that reach people in different ways. So, I mean, the documentary brings those words of survivors to life, and you get to walk through residential school sites and really see and feel the emotion of that process in a different way. And when it comes to the book, you can go deeper into the stories, right? So I think that they work well together with the blanket to, I don't know, to bring those stories to life in a different way than the artwork itself can.
How did the idea for the Witness Blanket come to you?
I'm like a carver by trade, and so when they put out that call, I started to think that I would like to do something about to artistically respond to residential schools, to commemorate them in some way. But I really wanted it to be the whole story. My father's a residential school survivor, and I didn't want to make it just our family thing. I wanted it to be a wider scope. So I set to work trying to think of something, and I thought about it for the better part of a year before I came up with this idea, and I rejected all sorts of other ideas like big sculptures, and all of them felt, even though they might have been large in scale, small in the number of stories that they could tell. And then I was sitting in my living room, and I had my feet on this little stool that folds up, and the pieces that are the basket for your feet, they're wood, and there's little strings that go through them and make it flexible. And at that time I was sort of thinking through the idea of gathering pieces of bricks and parts of the schools, and I thought, that's it, that's what I could do. I could get these pieces and bring them together and create a blanket out of solid objects, and that was the sort of genesis of the idea. And it was, like I say, it was like a process of elimination. How do you tell stories through art? And the way I chose to do it was through individual pieces, and then trying to record the stories that are attached to each one.
A massive undertaking that took you to many locations. Can you tell us a bit about where you did visit and what those experiences were like for you?
I got to go to a bunch of places close to home. So I went to St. Mary's Residential School, where my father went. I went to Seashell, where he went. I went up to Alert Bay, to St. Michael's, and interviewed with family members there. But as a team, we went all across the country.
More than 800, close to 900 items. How did you decide what you would end up using and what would be left out?
Very few pieces are left out. I had this process where I said that I would use something from every person who gave a piece and something from every place we went. Sometimes there's more than one from one place. Sometimes there's more than one from one person. But that was the general rule. If a contribution was made, then at least one of the pieces from that contribution would be included. So there's only a couple of physical objects that didn't make it onto the blanket. And then as far as all of the images and documents go, the ones that weren't transferred to the surface of the blanket are still part of the exhibit through, I have a school desk that was donated or given in Seashell. And with so many of the pieces, I had to cut them and change them, and I couldn't bring myself to change this desk. And so I kept it whole, and I placed it sort of behind the blanket through the door with the idea that it would draw people through. And then we project all of the additional images from that gathering process onto the surface of that desk. So that was, I really strived to include as many of the pieces as I could.
For you and your team visiting these locations, dealing with these delicate items and hearing these stories, that must have been pretty heavy, way heavy on you all. How did you handle that, deal with that?
Yeah, it's true, and you don't necessarily feel it right away because you're busy. You're thinking about the work that you have to do, and you're sort of thinking about it from for me, from the technical perspective of a piece would come in and I'd be like, how am I going to use this? And I was always in my mind thinking about them. But then slowly you start to, the stories seep in, and you start to, it builds up, right? The layers. And the way we dealt with that when I realized that this was something that I was going to have to continually maintain was through ceremony, through bringing in people to help brush us off and to brush off the pieces and to care for each step of the process in a traditional way. And that was really kind of transformative, and it's carried on in my life where I can feel it now when things start to weigh on me. And
I guess, like you say, when you're into it, you're getting the items, you're wondering how you're going to use them and stuff. Is that where the book maybe played more of that cathartic role, thinking back on just what all you'd gone through and the stories you'd heard and the items you'd seen and touched?
Definitely. When you're sort of in that creative process, I had this sort of catalog of every single piece, and I knew where they all came from, and I had as many of the stories sort of memorized in this sort of intellectual way, but I hadn't processed them in a way where I thought about and wrote about what they meant, and what they meant to me, and what they meant to my family. In writing the book and in talking with Kirsty and recording my feelings, it really helped me to ground a lot of those stories and ground that process and take them from here and put them into here. And I think that it's the making of the book does have a cathartic role for me.
I don't know if it's the same for an artist as, like for ourselves, we'll do a news story and you've kind of forgotten about it a week later or whatever, but, you know, how personally close do you feel to the witness blanket?
I feel an immense responsibility. One of the things about this project is that when you ask people to share their stories and give you parts of their memories and pieces that they've held on to, it's a very personal thing, right? And you have to, I think that you have to take it not as, I guess I have to take it differently than the other artworks that I've done, where I take some material and I make it into something and it is what I made it. This one might be partly what I made it, but it's also all of what everybody put into it, and that is an enormous amount of responsibility. And I did feel, and I still feel, a great deal of pressure that comes with that. Now, in the way that we place the blanket into this museum, through that agreement, I feel like I've shared a little bit of that responsibility now, because we've agreed together that the museum and me, are jointly responsible for the care of the blanket. But then we did the ceremony too. We did a ceremony in Comox where we animated, or we uplifted, this written contract through traditional ceremony. And in that we called witnesses. And so those witnesses are also taking part of that responsibility now. And so that was about a month and a half ago that we did that. And I've noticed a difference in how I feel since that's happened, because I feel like there are more hands holding it up.
And I'd like to get more into that agreement, but we just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Carey Newman.
The witness blanket may be the most important piece that I ever create, and I feel an obligation to bring it to as many communities as possible. We need to honor the survivors and remember the children who were lost. We need to speak openly about these stories to ensure that this never happens again.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is artist, master carver, filmmaker, and author Carey Newman, and we've been discussing the witness blanket. And Carey, I'm wondering if you can tell us about what was going through your mind, how when you first unveiled it, and what people's reactions were.
Seeing the way that particularly survivors responded to it, it really reaches me and makes me feel like I'm part of something important in a way where you see people connecting the dots between everyone, between themselves and all of the rest of the survivors across the country, and noticing the similarity in the architecture of the buildings, in the documents that were shared, in the stories that were told. And wow, I like I said, the best word I can think of is humbled.
And a replica continues to tour the country. Why is it important to keep this on the road, get more people to see this?
Yeah, I think that it comes down to the sort of original purpose of the work. And we can have the book and the documentary and website and digital apps, but there's something about the art process that I think is really important. I mean, for me, that's why I did it in the first place. I think that art reaches into people in a different way than the words on the page, because you're not necessarily articulating or spelling it out. So when people see all of those things collectively together, I think what happens is, because there's so many objects there, each of us have our own memories, and we attach our memories to the things that we see, and maybe you'll find something on there that reminds you of something from your past. And then, if this is a person who's not a survivor or an intergenerational survivor, or someone who hasn't been impacted by the legacy of residential schools, and they're maybe learning about this for the first time, then if they can see themselves in it in some way, then it can become important to them. And when things are important to people, then we're ready to make some sacrifices towards change. When we think about what reconciliation is, we've got all these events where we bring people together, but if we don't turn that into action, then what is it worth? Mm-hmm. My hope with the creation of that replica is that it can continue the work that the blanket was doing in some small way, and continue to turn people toward action.
I'd like to move to a couple of your other pieces of work, and another one that was an enormous undertaking was the Spirit Pole. Can you tell us about that project?
That was a project that I did for the Cowichan 2008 Indigenous Games. And it was a project conceived by a man named Ron Rice. And he envisioned this sort of, to replace the idea of a torch relay, he thought, why don't we take a totem around the province of British Columbia and have people carve chips from it? And he put out a call, and I was one of the people who responded, and I was a successful candidate. And it's interesting that you bring it up, because I don't think I would have ever made the witness blanket if I hadn't done the Spirit Pole. It was the first time that I came out of my studio and engaged with community. I spent so much of my early career just like head down, carving away, making things the way I saw them. And then when I got out into the community and started working with people, it transformed my idea of what art is and what it can be and what it can mean in a social context. So this totem, we took it around the province of British Columbia. We had over 10,000 people carve chips away from it, and we finished it and raised it for the opening ceremonies of those games. And yeah, it was my first foray into community engaged work.
We're going to talk about another games that you had some art displayed at, but we got to step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Carey Newman.
For me, when I look at it, it's the last little bits of some of those schools that are no longer around, and so it's the only chance that people have to touch something that came from that time.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Carey Newman. And Carey, before the break, we were talking about the Spirit Pole, but you also did another installation for the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. What can you tell us about that project?
That one is a work called Dancing Wind. It was part of a national call for Indigenous artists to make work that would be installed at the Athletes Village in Whistler, but also would be part of the Four Host First Nations Pavilion in Vancouver during the Games. It's made of big sheets of stainless steel that it was kind of like, making this piece was kind of like, I don't know, it was the most factory-oriented work I'd ever done, because we used water jets to cut, and then I had to polish all of this metal. And the idea of it is that it's the wind coming together from all four directions, and sort of based it on a couple of different ideas, where there's the four directions, and then the animals associated with the directions, and then the elements associated with those directions, culminating in a work that sort of sits across like this, but if you take it apart and put it together, it creates that each design connects to the next design to form one image.
As people are hearing, you work with all types of media, all types of items, but you're also a master carver. How does one become a master carver?
I don't know if I have a clear answer for that, because I don't know how I became a master carver entirely. I mean, I grew up, I was born into it, I guess, in a way. My father's a carver. My great aunt was a carver. My great-great-grandfather was a carver. So this is like something that I was born into, and I think it was always intended for me to eventually do. But my how it's been explained to me is, to become a master carver, you have to be able to carve anything, and so that's, and it's not something that you can claim for yourself. It has to be something that's given to you by your peers in your community. And I was pretty resistant to it for a long time, but I'm slowly becoming comfortable with the term.
Yeah, in addition to this all, you're also a professor. What lessons and skills do you look to instill in your students?
In my class, I try to bring the lessons I've learned from my life, the things that I learned from the witness blanket, the things that I learned from my culture, and put them all together and encourage my students to use their artwork, explore using their artwork for social purpose, to start to envision how the things that they make can interact with the issues that we have in this world, and to how they can use their voice to bring about change.
As an artist, author, filmmaker, musician, what advice do you have for those out there looking to follow their dreams into the arts?
I think you just got to dive in. So many people try to hold on to that sort of thing that we're told is important, the capitalist. In capitalism, you have to have a steady income. You have to have, and I know, I recognize the privilege that I've grown up with, because I got my start really early in a family that supported the idea of me being an artist from when I was small. But time and time again, I've seen when people take that leap and commit themselves to the work that they're doing, that's when it starts to work for them, because you can't, I don't know if you can do it when you're only committing part of yourself to it. So I guess it really depends on if that's what you want to commit your life to. But if you're interested, then start, and then if you love it, then do it, and just do it.
Well, Carey, it's been a real privilege to have you on the show here, and we appreciate you doing it here for us. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this week's show. We're always looking for new guests, so if you have any ideas, shoot us an email at news@aptn.ca. This show and past episodes are also available as podcasts, and you can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. That's all the time we have for this week. We'll see you next week. Dennis Ward.